Hello and welcome to the Justin Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And before we do jump into our topic of conversation today, just want to give you a reminder that Justin Center as an organization is supported by donors. You can go to justincenter.org, go to our donate page. There are all sorts of ways you can help us out here, either by donating yourself, a one-time gift, a monthly gift, or you can print off our brochures to give information about the kinds of things that we do and give them to somebody that you think may be interested. Also, a reminder to sign up for our newsletter. Go to justincenter.org. It's right there on the homepage. If you sign up for that, you will get updates on the things that we do, including through our new publication, The Conservative Reformer, where we release weekly articles from a Lutheran perspective dealing with issues of philosophy, culture, theology, and more. Well, we are going to be delving into Patrick Deneen's most recent book, and I did a couple programs a while ago on why liberalism failed, and people seem to really like at least the first part of that. The second one, for whatever reason, didn't get as much attention, and I don't know why that's the case. But people have asked me to give some comments on his more recent book as well. So we're going to be looking at Patrick Deneen's book, Regime Change. This is going to be an overview of some of his ideas. I'll certainly give some of my thoughts on his ideas, but largely this is really to just kind of express some of the things that are being talked about in broader cultural and political conversations. Now, I'm not a political philosopher. I am not a political scientist. I am a theologian. However, the ideas and themes that Deneen discusses in some of his texts are rather theological, whether they're not theological themselves, and some of them certainly are, and this is very clear with his Roman Catholic faith that forms a lot of what he says. They certainly relate to a lot of the conversations that, as Justin Center, we are involved in, and that relates to things like institutions and what the role of a Christian is in institutions and forming institutions and creating institutions, and how it is that we are to deal with our current culture and some of the crises that we're facing in our culture today. So I'm going to deal mostly with kind of the philosophical issues here rather than delving into particular policy issues, because the questions of policy are really better answered by those who are actually in the field of politics much more properly than I am. And to be honest, I don't think Deneen gives a lot of policy guidance, and that's actually one of the criticisms that a lot of people have toward this book in some of what I have read. All right. So I'm going to give just a quick overview. Who is Patrick Deneen? Now, many of you know who Patrick Deneen is. This is the same slide I had in the other first podcast, but just in case you're watching this one and not the other one, I just want to give an overview of who he is. If you have clicked on this and you haven't watched the other, just so you don't have to do that necessarily. So Patrick J. Deneen, birth date 1964. He's assistant professor of government at Princeton University from 1997 to 2005, and then associate professor of government at Georgetown University from 2005 to 2012. Then he became professor where he is today at Notre Dame, professor of political science, 2012 until today. And from what I have heard, he actually was considered for a position, the same position at Cornell University, which is where I'm engaged in campus ministry at Cornell. So unfortunately, he didn't end up here. I would be very shocked if honestly we got to anybody with the ideology of somebody like Deneen at that university. But he's done a lot of writing, and of course, we're talking about one of his books, so that's kind of obvious. But he's the founding editor of the publication Front Porch Republic. He's written a lot of articles for First Things, The American Conservative, The New Atlantic, a lot of the more well-known conservative publications that many of my viewers or listeners probably are quite familiar with. His best-selling work is Why Liberalism Failed, which was published in 2018. I think the sales numbers on that book are something like 60,000 sales, which is a lot. And it's being translated or has been translated also into a number of languages. If you haven't watched or listened to the talk on Why Liberalism Failed, whether even just the first one or the second one, I would urge you to do that. You don't have to watch this. But that book really diagnoses a lot of the issues with certain forms of liberalism and certain ideologies that thrive within a liberal context. Now, to be clear, talking liberalism here, what I don't mean is liberalism versus conservatism, he's speaking about the entire liberal project. So Deneen's criticisms are of left liberals and right liberals, as he calls them, basically all those who come out of that tradition that we generally associate with someone like John Locke. And then this is his most recent book that we're talking about here, called Regime Change Toward a Post-Liberal Future. And this book is really an attempt to give answers to the diagnoses that he has in his first book. So within the first book, Deneen makes contentions about the problems inherent within the liberal political tradition. And in this book, he seeks to provide what is an answer to that. How is it that we move forward? Recognizing these issues, what are we going to do to try to resolve those issues in our current context? Now, he's speaking within an American context. However, the things that he discusses certainly affect far more than just the United States. And my interest, as those who are regular viewers or listeners know, is much more in terms of broader philosophical issues and theological issues that affect how we view ourselves. So my concerns about liberalism are largely theological ones, because I think that the basic assumptions about some of the basic assumptions about liberalism, I think, have significant influence upon how it is that we view ourselves, how it is that we view human community, how it is that we view the purpose or role of the state, and how it is that we view our ethical life. And so I think a recognition of what some of those modern assumptions are is really essential for us to have a well-formed and well-thought-out life. So the examined life. Okay, Deneen also, he has a Substack called The Post-Liberal Order. There are plenty of other writers for that as well, mostly Roman Catholic writers. And what you're going to see is within this post-liberal milieu, the authors of the most prominent post-liberal texts and Substacks and all of the other articles are primarily Roman Catholic. I don't think that necessarily has to be the case. However, the solution certainly does, at least in many contexts, seem to be a preference for some kind of integralist Roman Catholic state. And that's much more clear in other authors, more so than it is in Deneen. Vermeulen would be an example. And we could certainly look at someone like Vermeulen in another program. I'd be interested in looking at his work as well. Now, just to give you an idea of where I'm coming from here, and again, I'm really more looking at what his ideas are. My own perspective on this is that I think that Deneen is correct in a lot of his criticisms. I don't know that the entirety of the liberal order needs to be kind of overthrown, as some post-liberals think. And some of that has to do with how broadly we're defining liberalism. So if you're looking at someone like Edmund Burke as a liberal, as Russell Kirk, for example, refers to him as a liberal in his book, The Conservative Mind, which is one of my favorite texts dealing with political thought, though not exclusively political thought. And there's a statement of Kirk in there. He says that Burke was a conservative because he was a liberal. And if you're talking Burkean conservatism and you're placing that under the kind of broader context of what you're calling liberalism, I certainly would place myself more under a Burkean conservative type context in terms of where I'm coming from in political and cultural theory as well. But that kind of Burkean conservatism, I think, is significantly different from a lot of the assumptions that we generally tend to associate with liberalism. So the nature of what we conceive of as rights. If you do want to see a talk on rights, my perspective on all of this, I gave a talk to the Cornell Republicans at Cornell University on this topic. I was invited to speak on that. So I'll try to remember to put a link below to that. But it's the conception of what's wrong with the modern conception of rights, I think, was the title of that talk, if you want to see my work on that particular issue. Just laying out the groundwork and letting you know where I'm at. So as we start to examine this. So my own approach to Deneen's work is largely sympathetic, though critical to some significant extent as well. I don't consider myself a post-liberal. However, I do think that a lot of the issues raised by the post-liberals, and I think as you're going to see, even some of the solutions are pretty similar to the solutions that I have proposed in a number of contexts as well. In terms of actual political parties, Deneen is part of the board of advisors for the American Solidarity Party. And if you're not familiar with the American Solidarity Party, they are maybe what I would call a big government conservative party. in many ways. This is a party that supports what's called common good conservatism, and we'll talk about exactly what that means. But this is a group that is trying to really overcome the left-right divide within the current political divide or milieu that we're dealing with today. Now, personally, because of my role, as a theologian and a ordained pastor, I don't feel it appropriate for me to do things like, recommend or endorse candidates or to endorse particular political parties. So I won't do that, and I won't touch on those particular issues. All right. So then let's move on to what exactly this book is about. Well, let's talk about the title, Regime Change. And if you look at the title, Regime Change, and you look at that image as well on the cover, it may give the kind of impression, or I think it does give the impression of an overthrowing of the current regime, right? That's what we're talking about with regime change. And this could be viewed in a kind of revolutionary type way of violently overthrow the current regime and install something new. And that's not exactly what he's talking about, but it's also kind of what he's talking about. So let's start with, this is from the introduction here. This is page 11. Just quickly, the citations that I have here are from the EPUB edition page numbers that I'm giving you here. I bought this book on my Nook, which is my Barnes & Noble e-reader. And because of just the fact that I have zero shelf space, all of my books on politics and political theory are ebooks instead of physical books. So that's what I'm citing. So if you have the physical book, I'm sorry, you'll have to figure it out. But here on page 11, regime change, this is what he says. He refers to this, he says, the peaceful but vigorous overthrow of a corrupt and corrupting liberal ruling class and the creation of a post-liberal order in which existing political forms can remain in place as long as a fundamentally different ethos informs those institutions and the personnel who populate key offices and positions. So clearly what he's talking about here is not just theory. I mean, he is proposing an actual change, and he has some ideas of how to enact that change, though I don't actually think it's that clear. But he has some conceptions of how it is that this change is to be made. And he does say here it's peaceful, right? He's saying he's not talking about some kind of violent revolutionary action. He's not talking about, invading and taking over the White House or something like that. This is no kind of conservative version of the French Revolution or something. We're not going to be beheading politicians in this proposed future that he has for the United States. But he calls it peaceful. So using regular political means, he has this desire to essentially install a new ruling class. And that's what he wants to do, is promote this new ruling class that is going to retain the political order that we have. Of course, the question that I have here is, can you really retain the current order that we have, or is that really what he's doing? Is this because we certainly have liberal assumptions within our founding documents and within the laws of the United States. I mean, it's certainly formative in terms of who we are. So the question I have is, can you really retain the structures that we currently have while also replacing the ideology that formed those documents completely? I don't know that that's a possibility, but that is certainly what he is arguing for. So he refers to it as a fundamentally different ethos that forms these people and institutions. Okay, so we're going to move on here then to something that I think is very helpful in terms of just our understanding of where we are in the world today. This is a text from James Burnham that is called The Managerial Revolution. This text was published in 1941, and it's a text that's cited very often within sociological or political texts, at least from a conservative perspective. I don't know otherwise, but this text speaks about these various stages of how it is that we have understood the elite and how it is that the elites have functioned within the American political context, but not just political, but also just broader cultural context. So it's kind of amazing. It's written in 1941. It is a rather prophetic text, and I do think that what Burnham is seeing at his time is rather obvious now, where we've kind of seen the fruit or flourishing of exactly what he's talking about here. And So Deneen relies on this to explain some of what's going on. Just quick comments on what Deneen is doing here. When I read this book, and to be clear, I really like a lot of what's in Regime Change. But what I don't see in Deneen is what I kind of hoped to see in this book, which was a very clear, positive path forward that laid out clear steps of this is exactly what we need to do. So even though he does do that toward the end of the book, I felt that, well, why liberalism failed was largely critique, and Regime Change was also largely critique. So it almost felt like he was kind of just expanding more on the critique of the first book, which, again, isn't bad. I think that a lot of his insights are very valuable and very helpful, but I don't know that it was quite as positive of a move forward. Now, I spoke at a conference that Deneen also spoke at this last January, and I listened to a talk. It was a panel. This was largely panels. I was on a panel. He was on a panel, but his panel was dealing with his arguments regarding post-liberalism. And on this panel, he was challenged a bit by a presentation critiquing some of his general ideas within this book. And so Deneen did give some responses to that in trying to define some specific policies, and he does that. But I think it was very clear, even in his response, where he basically said, well, I'm not like, he's like, I'm a political philosopher, and he does more the philosophical end of things, which is, well, that's kind of why I'm interested in reading him, because that's the stuff that I care about. But at the same time, it's like, you do need to have a very specific plan. Like, what are you actually going to do? How does this work in policy? He did have some ideas. So it's not like he doesn't have any ideas, but I still felt listening to him that there isn't really a fully formed conception of what there is of what the goal is, but how we actually get there, or just what policies should we enact to bring this about? What are the practical steps that we need to take to get here? So I think a lot of that really does need to be fleshed out more. And, maybe that's just not Deneen's role, because he is more of a philosopher than he is, someone who's actually engaged in policy. But I think there are a lot of things that make a lot more sense on a philosophical level that don't necessarily work on a policy level. Though, again, that's not my field either. So I'm not one to do it either. So, and people have critiqued me for the same reason. I've had, especially my book, In Defense of the True, the Good, and the Beautiful, which is largely just a critique philosophically of where we've gone as a culture, and doesn't really provide a good solution either. So I have gotten the same criticism, and I get it. But nonetheless, we do need kind of, if the change is going to be made, we need very practically minded people too, who actually have solutions to a lot of these things. And there are some that are proposing them, but I don't know that any of them are very good, to be honest. All right. Well, going back then to this other element of Deneen's critique of where we've gone today. We've got James Burnham's The Magisterial. I'm just thinking of my texts on Roman Catholicism that I'm currently reading that are sitting on my desk here, but Managerial Revolution. So when you look at the United States, just like any society, there are going to be those who are considered elites. And this is something that human beings just do. Anytime human beings, group in one way or another. This is true about children. Watch children playing a game. I watch my kids. I've got two boys, 9 and 11. But even when they're very young, 5 years old, you watch them play with their friends. Somebody takes the role of the leader, right? It tells everybody else, what's the game that we're playing? What are we pretending? What are you doing? This is just how humans function. So organizationally, we have certain people that take kind of leadership positions, and those who don't. And that's fine. And that's actually not fine. That's good. That's good because that's how anything ever happens. You ever do a class project when you're in high school? And at least my experience, when you do a group project, you're assigned, 2 other students, and you've got 3 of you in a group, and maybe 1 or likely 2 of those people aren't going to do anything, and you may have to kind of step in and take a leadership role and just do it yourself, which is really annoying. But that's an experience I know many of us have had, because this kind of, hope for this total egalitarian society where you don't have anybody that is in a position of, superiority. You don't have anybody that's in a position of of leadership in one way or another. It's not possible. It's a fiction. It is a nice theoretical idea, but it's not one that actually makes any sense within reality. And so, because of that, within the United States, though we don't have an aristocracy in the sense that many European countries certainly did, especially during the time of the American Revolution, there was no specific class that was given certain privileges just by being born of a certain family. We think of, aristocratic families, noble families, or in any kind of monarchic traditional society. But we do have, within the early United States, a certain group of families that does take on kind of that role. And those families are those that are connected to a lot of the founders of our country. Look at something like, the Adamses, the Adams family, not that Adams family, but where you have people within very important positions that end up, their children end up in important positions and grandchildren end up in important positions. We have what people talk about as old money families. You have families that became very wealthy during, just after the American Revolution, where that wealth was passed down. It was inherited by future generations. So those particular families become a kind of aristocratic class. This happens a little bit differently in the northern United States than it does in the southern. But either way, what you do have is these groups of individuals that have more influence than others. And you can read something like Edith Wharton's novels, and Edith Wharton writing about old New York in the 1870s largely. And she's my favorite author, but if you read her works, you get an idea of what that aristocratic society in New York was like. The Southern aristocracy, again, as I said, was quite different because their influence was for different reasons. But you certainly have what you might call a semi-aristocracy, certain people that are kind of leaders of culture, preservers of culture, those people who exhibit more influence than other individuals do in the shape of society. Well, this all changes with the Industrial Revolution. And what you have in that late 19th century period is kind of this battle between these two groups of elites. But the industrial elites, through the Industrial Revolution, the money starts to change hands from being that which is held by some very specific families through inherited wealth. All of a sudden, you have a lot of invention and innovation going on where these big industrialists, and you think of the Rockefellers, for example, and they're probably the most famous example. The Vanderbilts would also be another example, and often we think of those families as like old money, but really they're industrial money, which is very different. And there's this kind of conflict between the industrialists as well as the old money families, famously with this certain instance of this battle basically between the Astors and the Vanderbilts, the Astors being the old money family, Vanderbilts being this new money industrialist family. But the industrial elites get their money through, industry. And the amount of money that the industrial elites get really far surpasses what was passed down through these old money aristocratic families. And so you get these increased wealth disparities. Think of the Fords, for example, Henry Ford, and he mentioned the automobile, then the insane amount of the insane gap between those who are wealthy industrialists and the average American. And we have now moved beyond that, however, to a new group of elites that Burnham refers to as the managerial elites. So what exactly do we mean by the managerial elite? And how does that relate to these other groups of elites that we have had historically within our society? Well, the managerial elite, they are not those who, just own factories, say. And the industrial elites, we have this. And you could think of this in the largest sense of people like the Rockefellers. You've got these people that have just insane amounts of money. But this is also true in a more local sense. And so you have, for example, in one community, you may have a particular factory that is founded by a certain individual, And that factory may provide jobs for, 50% of the community that you live in. Well, the person who owns that factory is going to have a significant amount of wealth that is going to far surpass the wealth of those who actually work within the factory themselves. Now, that may not be, a Vanderbilt level wealth, but it is still significant wealth. What's significant about this, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is that within those industrial elite contexts, the industrialists still generally lived within the community of those who were working for them. And so there is this connection between the people who are elite and those who are not. And so look, I live in upstate New York, and if you drive around upstate New York, a lot of the communities in this area were founded in the early 19th century, and a lot of the population came in the mid-19th century. And this was the area of industrialization. And in most of these old towns, though unfortunately, in many areas of upstate New York, like the Rust Belt, you've had a lot of these jobs have been shipped overseas, and there is just poverty in some of these areas. But you have mansions, these old, beautiful mansions in a lot of towns where it was like that's where the elites lived. You've got the few mansions here. This was the family that's owned the factory that a lot of the people work in. And they're within the town. They can walk down to another street, which is where their workers probably live. So there is this connectivity of place and culture that you have between those who are the elites and those who are not. All right. But then we move toward the managerial elites. Now, the managerial elites are those who rule by planning, policy, abstract reasoning, manipulation of information. These are all phrases that Burnham uses, that Deneen also uses in his text. And so the managerial elites are those who rule not by owning some kind of factory. They don't rule through familial inheritance. Instead, they rule by being executives. They rule by making decisions about what's good, what policies are important, what policies are good for us, or manipulation of information. Think about those who are in positions of influence who put pressure on social media companies to get rid of what they refer to as misinformation or to promote certain ideas. So we're talking more about the management of information, the way that information spreads, the way that terms are used in, say, media. So you refer to something as misinformation. If you've decided that it's misinformation, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is misinformation. But the managerial elites kind of control the flow of information. And so this includes people like, and he mentions, Deneen here mentions some of these, business executives, scientists, engineers, financiers, consultants, etc. So you have this movement away from production of physical stuff that you have like in the Industrial Revolution, now toward the management of ideas and information. So you have this move away from a possession of things to the control of policy and the control of information. This happens through institutions. And this is something that you'll see just throughout history is elites always work through institutions. And the way that elites retain power and exert power are always going to be through institutions. In fact, society just functions via institutions. That's how societal change happens. So I'm not saying that this is all a negative thing, that's the case. That's just the reality. We as human beings need institutions. Institutions provide stability for us. They provide social connectivity for us. They give us an idea of identity and social function. And we could do another talk on institutions here as a whole, but I won't get into the definition of institutions, which is actually kind of a difficult thing to do. Sociologically, there are a lot of different, like hundreds of different definitions of what an institution is. But so we got this move away from things like the Industrial Revolution toward information, policy, control. This happens through certain institutions like media. So media determines what is good and what is not. Look at for example, the hostility of an interviewer in the media toward a certain interviewee versus perhaps another interviewee. They have discussed what questions are going to be asked in the interview beforehand to make the person look as good as possible. So it's like, well, even if you give both people airtime, clearly the media is determining what ideas you should listen to and what ideas you should not listen to. Just want to make another comment regarding statistics, because I think this is an important part of this as well. And we see all sorts of statistical studies thrown around all the time. And statistics appear to be something that may be rather neutral, because statistics are, objective facts. This many, people said this to a certain survey question, and this many people did not do that. The way that statistics are presented is anything but objective. And that's true all across the board. Statistics are not as objective as we tend to think they are. When a certain publication chooses to share statistics, they usually do so by picking out those certain statistics that validate their own claims, or the way that those statistics are presented is within a broader story or narrative. And I say this having family members who have written a lot of statistical reporting, is that you have to put statistics within a broader story, and usually statistical studies are financed by somebody. And they are financed by somebody not because someone just has an interest in the objective truth, but because they want those statistics to reveal something that is going to confirm or support something that they are doing. And so questions are worded in certain ways or reported in certain ways to give certain impressions of what is right and what is wrong. And as we saw, if you've followed the issue at Harvard University when there was that statistical study regarding violence from police officers toward those of minority races, if you know what I'm talking about, there was a study from Harvard that's caused a significant stir because the particular results of that study did not align with what was expected, which is just an issue that you find in statistical studies in general. So that is one way that I think these managerial elites tend to rule, is by the presentation of information, and even if it is maybe seemingly more objective information, the packaging of that information. So we've got media, schools, that's an obvious one, nonprofit organizations. I run a nonprofit organization, and not that we have a significant amount of power or something, but we certainly have a bias. Corporations, especially like places on corporate boards. Recently, there has been this, as I'm recording this, there's been this proxy battle within Disney. And you have this activist investor, Nelson Peltz, who's trying to get a couple individuals on the board to try to change the direction of Disney. And those who were most adamantly opposed to Nelson Peltz were those who were on the board who were with companies like Vanguard and BlackRock, who tend to control a lot of the way that information and the kind of information that is spread throughout the media. So corporate boards, you're managing information, you're determining what it is that the people are going to see, what they're going to hear, the values that are going to be placed within the television shows or movies that are being viewed. There is also within this managerial elite a move toward urban centers and away from the general populace. And this is where you have this divorce of the elite from the average person. So with the industrial elites, as I said, you have this connection between the elites and those who are working for them, because they generally still live within the same community. And within one community, you may have different groups of people. You may have one street that is the very large houses, the wealthier area, but you may go to another street, which is kind of middle class, and then you may go to another neighborhood within town that is those who are of lower income. And they're all living life together to some degree. And you have this kind of gradual isolation of these elites, those who are the wealthiest, toward very particular zip codes. And so if you go, for example, to Greenwich, Connecticut, or you spend time in Westchester County in New York, there are certain parts of San Francisco. There are certain areas where you have this very isolated group of people who are making decisions that are going to affect the populace, not just of their regional community, but are going to affect the populace of the entirety of the United States. And oftentimes there are actually global impacts because of the globalization and just interconnectivity between nations. So the things that you may decide may be formed by just your own isolated little community of people who think and live just like you do. So you're totally divorced from what are the needs or desires of the average person. This is a major issue. And I think that we need to recognize this as a major issue, even whatever part of the political spectrum that you are on here. It is really important for the people who are in charge of making policy or decisions, whether it's in politics or something else, to actually know the people they're making policies and decisions for. It's very odd that the opposite is really the case. I mean, just even my work here at Cornell, you have certainly a lot of students that come, they tend to come from these zip codes. You've got like the super zips in the DC area or the mainline Philadelphia, or people come from certain areas where they simply live with other people of high income, and the majority of them are politically left. That to the point that there are some people that I encounter stories of certain students who are more conservative in their political views, and when that's found out by other students who come from these kinds of areas, they look at them like they're like an alien. Like, it's like, what are you? Who are you? What does this mean? This is so strange. And it's not even always in a hostile way. Sometimes it's in just a like, what? That's so weird, because they're so disconnected from the people that they're going to really be managing, because these are people that are going to go, a lot of them are going to go work for BlackRock and Vanguard, and they're going to go off to these, and it's not all finance, obviously, but they are going to work for these major corporations really without any idea of how the average American lives. It's not healthy at all, but we are increasing in that direction as well. So we have this move toward these urban centers. So people start to move out toward the cities. And then we also have some of them then moving out of the cities. And in moving out of the cities, these managerial elite are starting to simply like buy homes in towns that have a historic population, families that have been there for many generations and have built, beautiful houses and architecture. And they just kind of take over these towns, right? They come to these towns and, maybe tear down all the historic homes, or they basically just replace the populace that was there, so that now the town becomes unaffordable for those people, and they just kind of take over. And then it's like, well, these people have all the beautiful towns. Why is that the case? That their places are so much prettier than all the conservative ones? Well, that's why. And I say that, and this is like the town where my wife grew up, and a lot of where I grew up too. But okay, so we've also got this move toward what people talk about as like a global community, this move away from this localism to understanding your local community, your local customs, what are the needs of the people within that particular community, and you move toward what are the needs of humanity as a whole, this kind of abstraction. So we have a move away from community, place, custom, culture, all of these things. So this managerial elite is essentially placeless. They're not rooted in any particular community. They may live in one particular community, and these are largely commuter towns. So if you go to places in, Connecticut or New Jersey, you have these commuter towns for New York City where you have a lot of very wealthy people living because they have a quiet neighborhood, nice home. They want a giant yard because they don't want to be near anybody else. So they're separating themselves from community, but they're not really like connected to the place in the same way that people are within traditional communities or towns. They live there because they want a nice place to have their, 2 kids and golden retrievers and everything else. But they really are connected more to their work in the city, in something like New York City, as I'm talking about here with Connecticut and Jersey. But so they're not really connected to the place they live. They live there because it's pretty, because they can get a big home, because they have a lot of advantages living there, because they can live with other people that are also of high income. And then they can talk all sorts of ways about how much they care about the poor, and how much they care about minorities, and how much they care about this and that community. And they'll give some money toward organizations to help those people, but they don't want them living in their communities. That's the managerial elites for you. So they're essentially placeless. The way that they think about problems, whether it's politics, cultural, or otherwise, It's all based on abstract reason. So they're not looking at what are the needs of these particular people in this particular place. They're thinking, what is good? What things do I want the world to look like? And then you push policies that are going to promote this kind of abstracted good as you see it. And they want a kind of global rule in many ways. Now, I'm not talking about some kind of, Illuminati conspiracy or something like that. But when you look at something like the World Economic Forum, it's very obvious that the leaders of this managerial class have a desire to have this kind of global rule in some way, or policies that are going to affect the human community, as we talk about this international community. And this kind of global rule is not one that is being enforced by some centralized individual or something, but it's really accomplished by the use of data, examination of data, publication of data, as we've talked about, providing universal consumer goods toward people across the globe. Ideas of what is an international crisis, talk about the global warming crisis, and the global warming crisis, and I'm not going to make comments about the veracity of all of that. It's not my place. I don't really care to do that. But the global warming crisis just becomes then a way to say, well, let's get all of the policy experts from these different fields all across the globe and get them together, and then we can make decisions about what's good for the world in this kind of abstracted sense. And then local communities are just kind of forced to live within these global decisions and this kind of global rule. So there is this disassociation from the working class, which ultimately is what we're seeing here. And this is not just a dissociation from the working class, but it's an act of prejudice toward the working class. And so this is where you have portrayals of those who are in the working class as buffoons, people in the working class as being backward and ignorant and prejudiced. And so there is an animosity toward the very people that you are making decisions for. And this is true not just politically, but this is true in media. So, for example, look at Star Wars, since it has been owned by Disney. I mean, if you look at the statements by those who are making TV shows and on the story group and whatever else, even authors of books that are being written, there is this disdain for the people who are the ones who have driven the franchise in the first place. They want you to consume their content and say, buy our stuff, give us money, but you're also backwards and evil and we hate you, but give us more money. Like, it doesn't even make any sense. It's completely incoherent. The business strategy is just crazy to me, but they're so kind of disconnected from just normal working people, or those who that they are making decisions for or producing content for, whatever it might be, that they think they can both tell you what's good for you and disdain you at the same time. It's very odd, but that's the way that this seems to have worked itself out. There's also a disdain toward the past. So this is where you get this constant rhetoric from the managerial elite of, well, this is whatever the current year is, as if, oh, you hear that and you think, oh, well, it's this year. That means that, of course, this thing that you've told me is true, because we have advanced from 5 years ago. We were all complete idiots back then, and we didn't know anything. And all of our religious traditions and all of our philosophers and all of our just inherited even common sense and passed down generational wisdom, all of that is just garbage, because Judith Butler has told me something that she has this new book that she has released and has made new discoveries about the nature of gender. So we can throw out all of that stuff because we're enlightened now, and we have these new intelligent ideas that our managerial elites have passed down to us so graciously. So there's this idea that the past is bad. It's a prejudice against the past no matter what. Not just to say, of course there are things wrong in the past. There are always going to be things wrong in the world. And it's not we learn from mistakes in the past. We look at the past as a mix of beauty and goodness, as well as some profound evils. And we try to, as we move forward, look at those things that were evil and overcome them. It is instead the past is dumb. We know more than other people. This is why we have this disdain toward older generations. This is why we mock older generations. And you have these generational feuds, which are just ridiculous because we have made this decision that to be young and to have ideas that are new is always to be better. The language of sin and vice within this managerial elite, classical language, talking about evil in the world has now just been replaced with language of harm. So you're not talking in a classical sense of what is evil, what is wrong, but harm. It's kind of, it sounds nicer, but at the same time, it is judged sometimes even more harshly than we would judge sin to be. Okay, so then, looking at all of this, we may say, okay, well, all of that is what's going on within the political left, and therefore what we need is just the political right in the United States. Deneen is saying that's not a solution either. We have this question that is constantly asked. That is conservatism within the United States just progressivism, but it's moving more slowly? Like, yes, we should make changes, progressive changes, and humanity is getting better and the world is getting better, but we just have to be a little more careful about it. And there's validity to this critique, I think, because there are many things that those who consider themselves conservative seem to think are okay that conservatives 50 years ago, none of them would have thought was okay. And so it does seem that there is this leftward drift in everybody, and it's just a little slower among the conservatives. Look, let's just be a little more careful. Let's be the liberals of 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And what Deneen says is that the conservative view that's called conservative is that transformative progress is a key goal of human society. This is what liberals, both left and right, believe. And so it's his contention, at least, that the American right has often looked in the same way. He argues that we need to recapture what is really the pre-liberal tradition of the West, rather than relying on the liberal tradition, whether left or right. And he basically says a lot of people that are considered kind of modern conservatives are really nothing more than classical liberals. So he cites, just as one example, Jonah Goldberg. And I think Goldberg is pretty clear about this now. I watched a discussion that someone pointed me to this, that Jonah Goldberg had on Deneen's book. And it was interesting to watch, I would say, for a couple reasons. One is, looking at his view numbers, they were much lower than like my first video on Deneen's book. And I'm like, I'm nobody. But so I don't think someone like Goldberg is really that influential anymore. Maybe he has a following to some degree, but I don't think he's someone that has a significant following, certainly not among younger, whether it's conservatives or classical liberals. But the other thing is, I felt like his conversation was just a lot of ad hominem attacks, and I didn't really feel like there was a lot of substance to it. And I would welcome more substantive challenges, actually, to Deneen's work, but I wasn't finding it at all there. But I think that's kind of obvious. There are people that are considered conservative or had been in the past that really are more classical liberals than they are conservatives. So that though is just kind of the result of this fusionist alliance that was made in the 20th century to really defeat communism, and I think was successful in doing that. But at this point, it has just become very clear that there are a lot of different ideologies that have kind of been placed under the label conservative that really are not well aligned. So in light of all of these issues going on there, Deneen points to a debate that exists between Platonic philosophy and Aristotelian philosophy, political philosophy in particular. And so we have this kind of never-ending tension within human societies between the idea of the wisdom of the few, or the wise few, as well as the wisdom of the many. Now, there are, of course, people that are more intelligent than others. There are people that are more educated than others. There are people that just naturally have wisdom that is greater than that of other people. And those people have a significant place within society. However, that does not mean that there is not also profound wisdom within just the human populace as a whole. And a lot of just human intuition and a lot of things that we think about as like common sense, they are things not that are just kind of random impulses that we have for no reason, but they are based on things that have been passed down for many generations. So a lot of the things that are just common inherited wisdom are inherited wisdom because those things have been proven to actually be effective and wise throughout many centuries or generations. It doesn't mean that every passed on idea is necessarily good. Of course, there are things that have been assumed to be common sense or assumed to be, inherited popular wisdom that are wrong, and that happens. But there's also a lot of goodness that is passed down in those ways as well. So there is immense benefit to simply listening to what is the common wisdom of regular people and what we conceive of as something like common sense. So what we have is a bit of a difference between Plato and his conception of the ideal state in the Republic and Aristotle's. So Plato famously has this idea of a philosopher king, and he thinks that the best society is the one that's going to be ruled by an individual that is a philosopher. And so the person who has this immense wisdom can guide kind of objectively society toward its proper and good end. And if you read the Republic, Plato's vision of a government is rather tyrannical. I love Plato in a lot of ways, but not a society that I would particularly have any desire to live in. Now, he does seek to have ways to make sure that the philosopher king really is ruling for the sake of the love of wisdom, such as the lack of property that philosopher king would have, so that it's not someone who is driven purely by material wealth. Aristotle speaks instead, though, about a mixed constitution. And this idea of a mixed constitution is that any proper society has this mixing between the few and the many. So we have this blending of some kind of an aristocracy, and Aristotle does support an aristocracy, and he speaks about those who he believes should be the aristocrats in a given society. But we should have this kind of aristocratic class in whatever way it shows up, and we should have the common people, but they should be in conversation with one another, and that they should work for each other's mutual benefit. So ideally, you have a society where you have the aristocrats who are serving and ruling for the good of the people, and not just the good of the people in some abstracted sense of we live far away from all the people, we tell them what's good for them, but that they're actually among the people and with the people and are making decisions for their benefit. And liberalism, as Deneen says, has a kind of aristocracy, but this kind of aristocracy is really more one that's, by achievement than by birth. So, you go to the right schools, you make the right connections, you work hard enough, and you are going to become influential. And so the uniqueness about the United States is you can become the most influential person in the nation without any, birthright. So look at somebody like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, or you have the social media giants where you have, and not that Musk is just that, but you have these people in tech who have risen to those positions who often don't have any real connections to an elite class at all. They have just kind of climbed the ladder because of innovation or because they made connections at the right time or whatever else it might be. But there's a need for common sense, as Deneen says. And so and I mentioned these already, but I'll just reiterate some of these. Okay, first is that common sense is passed down from generation to generation, and often the reason it continues to be passed down is because it works, because it's practical. And so that means that passed down wisdom actually often is wisdom, and that we shouldn't try to reinvent the wheel and just get rid of common wisdom and say, we're just going to start from scratch with our kind of empty brains, and we're just going to look at reality objectively and come to a knowledge of what's good. We have inherited wisdom from the past, and we need and should work within that. The second point in terms of this common sense is that knowledge cannot only be specialized. And this is a problem that we have within the academy, but also just within policymaking, is that the academy as a whole privileges specialization in such a narrow way that there is no conception of wisdom as a whole, wisdom as a unit. Instead, we just know a lot about one very little specific thing. We have specialists, but we don't really have these kind of generalists that we had in the past. You don't have your Renaissance man. That doesn't exist anymore. It's an impossibility because of the way that the academy functions. And if you do try to be a generalist, or you try to connect wisdom more broadly from these different traditions or ideas, then people accuse you of speaking outside of your field of expertise and tell you to basically shut up. And I know that because I'm told that all the time. But and I purposefully have chosen not to just Okay, so with the work that I do, right, I could choose to focus all of my time and energy on, say, the doctrine of union with Christ in 17th century Lutheran scholasticism. Love that doctrine, something I've spent a lot of time on. Now, I could focus very narrowly on that, to the point that I could tell you exactly which of the 17th century scholastics, what little phrases they chose to use to speak about the interpenetration of the divinity and the humanity, and I could get a lot more in depth on those particulars. Would I be making an impact in the world in a beneficial way if I spend my life writing academic papers that 10 people are going to read in this extremely narrow field? And to some extent, I just don't care. I don't think it's that important to do that. I don't think that's the most important thing that we should be doing. We need to be speaking across fields. We need to be speaking with those who have expertise in other fields, and also do so with the understanding that knowledge is a unit. Knowledge is not just these like little specks of specializations that we can divorce from one another. And I have my specialization here and you have your specialization here. You're not going to communicate to people in that way. We need to have these units of knowledge in a way that it can actually be passed down from generation to generation. And so we can't just be speaking about specialized knowledge. Now, is specialized knowledge as a whole bad? No. But to stick within a very narrow specialization without a broad understanding of knowledge as a whole creates this huge disconnect between us and the people that we're communicating with, but even across fields. I mean, it's amazing how when you look, for example, at, say, the fields of linguistics and theology, right? Theologians think they found these great insights into linguistics. This is just one example, but there are tons of others. Great insights into linguistics, and they're relying on like 1960s linguistic theory that's basically been abandoned by contemporary linguistics. Because we're so narrow that nobody's talking to each other, and we're not speaking about knowledge as a whole. The knowledge that we need in terms of like this common sense that is inherited and passed down should retain the values of the past and the continuity of culture. Again, that doesn't mean no critiquing of the past. That would be extremely naive. And that is a critique that's been thrown out toward Deneen and I think this is a valid critique, and this is true about, a lot of Roman Catholic traditionalists in general, is that there is this, I think, idealizing of the past in a very unhealthy way, that's almost as if it's the intention to say, because it's old, it's always better. I see this with some of the rejections of, say, modern architecture. I think this is a great example. And to be clear, I'm not saying there's something to critique about modern architecture, but I've seen there was discussion about this, mid-century modern style home on Twitter recently. I don't have the image of it, I'm sorry, or it showed. I wasn't thinking about this as I was preparing this, but there was this critique of this home, and this is so ugly. This is why modernity is terrible. And I look at that home and say, this home actually, though it's modern in style, it is actually consistent with like all of the traditional standards of what is beautiful in terms of harmony and balance. So just because it's new does not mean it's bad. And I think that this is something that's mistaken in a lot of traditionalism, especially among Roman Catholics, but not exclusively, is that there is almost this idea that because it's old, it's automatically better. So if I write poetry, for example, instead of doing things like I need to have like form and imagery and the kinds of things that, meter, those kinds of things that are kind of transcendent across time in poetry that create the poetic form itself. We say like, well, I need to be writing a poem about, Odysseus, or it's like, I need old things in my poetry. That's more grabbing onto old things for the sake of old things, rather than trying to work within a culture and preserve beauty and innovate in ways that are also consistent with classical principles. I think that's really something more I would like to see. And I think that's a critique Deneen has received, and there's validity to that critique. So this kind of classical culture or a culture that he is calling for would be one that also respects the elderly and doesn't just look at anything old as something to be thrown away, including people. I mean, the way that past generations are spoken about is just, it's insane and wrong. I saw like a recent, was it like a TikTok or Instagram reel? It was someone that it was a millennial, so my generation, talking about boomers of like, I really just don't like them. They're so prejudiced. Their ideas are so wrong. And I kind of just, if I meet a boomer, I just don't want to talk to them. I don't want to be friends with those people. Like that's a horrible thing to say. And that kind of idea, and to be clear, the boomers did it to their parents. And they kind of started this trend. But it doesn't mean we have to repeat it. Okay. So then we have what Deneen calls for, which is the creation of a new elite. And so essentially, elites are inevitable in every society to some degree, as we've talked about here. But these elites, so we can't get rid of them. And so to say we're fighting for some pure egalitarian, eliteless society is an impossibility. So we need to just stop talking that way. It's silly. It's not going to happen. Instead, we need to say, well, how is it that we can have elites that are just? So they're inevitable in every society, but we should have elites that desire to work toward the good of the common people. And we should have elites that work in accord with the wisdom of the common people, that don't throw out old wisdom, that don't throw out things that are inherited and passed on and just say, you're ignorant and bigoted and dumb, and we're going to tell you what's really right. So what we want, or what Deneen is calling for here, is the creation of a virtuous elite. So an elite that displays virtue and acts virtuously and makes decisions that are virtuous ones. And so what he calls for here is the mixed constitution that Aristotle speaks of, where we have the elite and the common people coming together as a society, as a kind of mixed or blended society, where there is harmony and there is affection between them. I think this is a really beneficial and wonderful thing. And this, he says here, to be clear, what he's not talking about is just balance. So it's not like we've got to balance so that the managerial elites have their voice and the people have their voice too. But we're arguing for, or at least hoping for, pushing for a mutuality and harmony, that these people actually know each other and actually work together. This is something I think is extremely beneficial. And I look at this with even my own, I don't want to give too many personal details away, and I try not to do that, but so I'll speak a little vaguely here. Just in my own, and I've seen this modeled, and I feel like in my parents and how I was raised, in that my father has a job that would be, and has had historically, a position that would be considered part of this probably managerial elite. And when I was 2 years old, my parents moved to Massachusetts from New Jersey. Whole family's from New Jersey, going back to the 1640s. So I know you all hate New Jersey. Sorry, but maybe you hate me too, and that's why. But when they made the decision, when we took this job, decision about where to live, my father purposefully chose a town that was a mixed, basically what you call mixed constitution, right? A town that was, you had people who were very wealthy, and then you also had, people who didn't have a lot of money at all, but kind of living in the same community. Whereas a lot of people taking positions at the same company that he worked for tended to live in those areas that are like, everyone is like us. They're kind of all upper middle class people. And, there's a lot of competitiveness. All their kids go to, a lot of the kids go to Ivy League universities, and he purposely made the decision not to do that. And I think that's a really, really was a very good thing. And I appreciate that. I don't know, wisdom. I think there is this profound wisdom in that. So, growing up, our next door neighbors were a Harvard legacy family going back generations and generations. But, down the road, we had like on our street, we had, rental homes with rather poor families that lived there, definitely lower middle class. And I think that's the kind of thing that we want and should want within our towns and our communities, that there is interconnectivity. People are actually engaging with each other. I mean, it's a sad thing when you have, and that's the case where I live now, is you have, Ithaca, New York, where you've got Cornell University. So it's this Ivy League school, and the people that are associated with that school all live there. And then it's like the town next to it, it's a bunch of farmers, and they don't talk to each other. It's like totally different worlds, that are kind of isolated. from one another, and that's not a healthy way to live. And so, ideally, you'd have this mixed constitution of society, and I think towns should be set up that way as well. Well, culture, as Deneen says, arises really from the bottom, from the wisdom of the people, and then kind of moves up. I don't know that I agree with that position. I think that's true to an extent, but I think he overstates his case there. I'll just leave it there. These elites that he's calling for should care for the rural and the local, and not just the urban and the global. So be concerned with people in all different places, specifically within the places that they are. And those who are in these elite positions should not really even be that concerned with global issues, but should instead be concerned with the community in which they in particular are placed, which I would refer to as Martin Luther's doctrine of vocation, which is this idea that we all have unique vocations and callings, and that we need to recognize what our vocation and calling is and not kind of step outside of the bounds of that and pretend that it's something else. So if God has placed you as somebody with the kind of, elite education or more influence within a particular community, that means that God's calling for you is to serve for the good of your neighbor in that community, not to just take that and just say, but I don't want to do that and I want to do something else. And that's where God has called you. So the title for this system that Deneen is talking about here, he calls it Aristopopulism. And this, I'm not a populist, and I have a video on that if you want to watch that. And I don't think populism is a good title. I don't think, and it's very vague, so who the heck knows what the heck it means, but I don't find it particularly beneficial as a label. But what he argues for is a kind of blending of this aristocracy or this aristocratic inclination and then this kind of populist inclination. So what he argues for within this Aristopopulism is that this aristocratic class is not a credentialed class. And so right now, those who are the most important or looked at to be the most wise in society are people that have the right credentials. So they have the right degrees from the right institutions, or they have been featured in the right media, or we've got these, whatever it is, we've got these different credentialing institutions, whether it's kind of an official credentialing or kind of an unofficial endorsement of certain individuals. These aristocrats should be self-conscious preservers of the inherited goods of culture. And so we're thinking of things like family or community, religious belief, etc. And this is something that is odd with these groups of the elites that we currently have, is that there is this kind of disconnect between what is promoted politically and what is promoted verbally versus how they actually live. Because if you look at those who are the managerial elites, many of them live very traditional lives in a lot of ways. So many of them, for example, those who are of an upper class are far more likely to be married, to have kids in marriage, and less likely to get divorced. Like traditional family structures actually thrive much more within this class. And I think that's actually changing generationally, so I think that's going to die out. But at least at one time, that certainly was the case. Those who are of this class had been historically, at least within the kind of boomer generation, those who did preserve the traditions of Western culture in many ways. And I think now they're kind of seeing that bite them, because there's a move against that. So just as an example, where I grew up in Western Massachusetts, we're near out near the Berkshires, western and the farthest western part of Mass, where Tanglewood is. If you know Tanglewood, it's where the Boston Symphony is there over the summer, and it's one of the premier classical music venues in the certainly in the United States. And the people that live there are very liberal. It's one of the most liberal counties in the country. However, they're the ones that are promoting Western art, and they love classical music, and they support and promote classical music, and it's wonderful, and I love it out there. And they, their homes are very classical Western architecture. So there is this, and many of them are married and have kids and don't have kids out of wedlock, at least in certain generations. As I said, I think that has changed. So there is this kind of disconnect where they kind of have served that role of preserving these passed on, this passed on inheritance to the West. But at the same time, they've spoken as if they don't. We're now moving into a period where I think that's dying out. And I think that the last vestiges of that are going to be basically gone. If you spend a significant amount of time in certain areas, like if you go out to the Berkshires or you spend time in, Connecticut or in wealthier areas of New England, at least, a lot of those who are very liberals of boomer generations, for example, still dress rather traditionally. Like there is a little bit of a sense of class in dress and inherited norms culturally or in terms of etiquette or other things. But I think that is really being lost as we move on. But these elites that Deneen is talking about here would self-consciously preserve those things and pass them on, right? Not just sponsor them themselves, but also pass them on to future generations. And that includes family, community, religious belief, and I would say arts, music, those kinds of things as well. And this is the unfortunate thing, hasn't been passed on. So this is why, for example, here, the Syracuse Symphony, or not just the symphony, the Syracuse Opera Company just canceled all performances last year, which was awful because the fact is that it is only one generation that is going, and that is the 65 and over, really. And those things have not been passed on or inherited, which is sad. Okay, then the next point here, this is one that I've made a lot, and I've tried to make a lot to students here, which some of them get annoyed about, but and that is that there is this kind of self-deception that elites engage in, a self-deception of, like, nobody wants to say they're upper class, right? Everybody is, you're either middle class or you are lower middle class or upper middle class. That's everybody. Nobody wants to say that they actually are upper class. Nobody wants to say that they are elite. And so this is why you get people within elite institutions, elite universities, like complaining about the injustices of their institutions when, like, they're at the most elite institutions in the world and they're pretending like they're just critiquing some class of people that's not them, which it is them. That's the point. They are the elites. If you are at an Ivy League university, like, to some extent, you are an elite. You are in a position that a very small percentage of people in the United States are actually in, to have impact within our nation, but also within the world. And it does not help anybody to pretend that you are not elite, to just, like, complain about injustices in some abstract sense because you want to feel like you're one of the people or you're oppressed or something. I don't care what race you are. If you are at an Ivy League institution, you have privilege. That is an immense privilege. You are in a much more privileged place than the majority of people in this nation. And you have connections that are going to bring you in a place that is far more influential and significant than the majority of people. And so the best thing you can do is stop, like, just pretending that you're not, and, like, some weird self-guilt trip about, your position. Instead, just say, yes, I am in a position of influence, which means that I have been given a lot of responsibility, which means that because I have been given that, I better do something good with that influence instead of just using it for self-gain. And that's how people in this position should be thinking about themselves, not as either pretending they're oppressed or saying that, pretending they're just, like, better than other people, but instead saying, no, I have been given this unique responsibility and unique opportunity, and so I better use it for good. And it's only when you recognize that you actually are going to be able to do something positive with the responsibilities you've been given. Because without recognizing that, you're just going to ignore it. And so this new aristocracy that Deneen is calling for is one that isn't going to do that. They're going to say, yes, we have been given this position, and we are going to try as hard as we can to steward that well. And we are going to make sure that there are systems of accountability to make sure that we do. Not like this unchecked ruling class or something. And this is ultimately what Deneen wants. He says that what we need is the development of a ruling class that is itself informed by the very values Lind believes were once regnant as the price of admission to the elite status itself. What he's talking about here is he's saying that what we need to have is not just an elite class that maybe cares a little more about virtue, or some more of them are Christians or something, but instead that this is inherent within what it actually means to be elite. So that to strive to be elite, which people do and are always going to do, but you need to give them something to actually look up to. Instead of making this standard of like money, which is why, what are all the most like popular influencers on social media talking about? Money, right? How to be a high value man and how to make ridiculous amounts of money, how to be a millionaire fast and how to get lots of women. Like, people are always going to look up to those who they see as having achieved something, and they're going to strive for it themselves. So if what you get is an elite class that is virtuous, and that is not just part of who they are, but that's actually the function, purpose of who they are, is that life of virtue, then what that's going to do is set a standard for the rest of society to try to strive for, if that's what you look at as virtuous. And again, I think this actually was largely the case in the past, before this managerial class. And really this, I think the whole kind of tech thing upended everything, and not in a lot of ways, not in good ways. So that like at one time, so for example, the industrial elite, take that group of people, even though they rose to prominence financially through finance, there were certain rules of decorum and action and behaviors that they engaged in to make themselves appear elites. And some of that is just because they had to do that to fit in with the old elites. So, for example, I have like Amy Vanderbilt's book on etiquette, which is a very well-known text on etiquette in the 1950s. And that is written by an industrial class elite, not somebody that was part of that old money group. However, at the time, it was the understanding that like, you have to act like this, you have to dress like this if you're going to be part of the elite, and then people just kind of follow and do it. And that at that time, that meant that there was a sense of decorum. There was a sense of certain ways you behave, certain ways that you dress. There was a certain respectability that was expected of you if you are in a position of influence. And to act in a way that is vulgar, which now we prize vulgarity, to act in a way that is vulgar would actually diminish your status. And that's how it should be. Like, we should have the social stigmas around vulgarity. And I'm not just talking about vulgarity in terms of certain words that you use, but I mean like in terms of your sexual promiscuity, especially the visible and open desire for things that should be kept quiet, and really, well, things that shouldn't be engaged in at all. I'm trying to like be as vague as possible because I don't want this to get demonetized. I'm sorry. You know what I mean. All right. So let's move on to the final slide. I know this is a long program here, but that's okay. This is a big topic, and I think it's important to spend time on it. I would have done this in 2 parts, but I realized that through the last one that nobody listened to the second part, so I don't want to do this again, because then you'll all just watch the first one and not the second. So I'll just do it all in one. All right. How do we achieve this? And that's really the question that I think that Deneen struggles with. And I don't know that he has great answers to this. Because this is very similar to the idea that I've proposed of the Christian gentleman, this idea of restoring this gentlemanly class, which comes from James Fenimore Cooper. And it's something that I strive to tell people to do, to encourage people to do. And I strive to emulate that myself. And there are certainly people that are striving to do that. But that's like a personal one-on-one level. How do you actually make these people influential? Is this even possible? And that's really the question I have. I don't know. But here are just some ideas that Deneen throws out here. He speaks about bringing about Aristotelian ends through Machiavellian means. And that's a phrase. It's a phrase. And Machiavelli, I'm probably going to do a program on Machiavelli, but his text, The Prince, one of the most important political philosophers. But what the impression that this gives is of like kind of radical overthrow of the current state of things to achieve a just society. And that could be interpreted in all sorts of ways. But he does say peaceful in a number of places. So he's got some ideas, I guess, of how to do this. And here he says, this must begin with the raw assertion of political power by a new generation of political actors inspired by an ethos of common good conservatism. I'm just going to leave that as is, I think. I don't know how I feel about that or what that means. This what he is calling for is something rather forceful. What exactly does that look like, or does that mean? I am not totally sure. Decrease the power of progressivism. Okay, that's one seems obvious, but how would we do that, of course? And this is the thing, like, how do we, a lot of these suggestions are like, this is great, but like, what does that look like? How do you actually implement that in reality? He mentions a suggestion that George Will once made, which was to increase the representatives in the House to 1,000, something that would just give broader representation of the broader population, which, makes great sense, actually. It's not a bad idea. Will that actually happen, or is there a way to actually implement that? I have no idea. Probably not, but it's a nice suggestion. Break up DC. All right, how do you do that? Again, like, how do you do that? You talked about like the super zips, where you get these small communities that are people of immense influence and power, and they're all concentrated in the same place. It's not healthy. It's not good. That is part of the problem of this kind of increased isolation of those who are the ruling class, and a divorce from the ruling class from the common people. Next, greater influence of elected leaders over educational institutions. Sounds like a terrible idea. It sounds like a terrible idea. It just sounds awful. But so here's the thing. But my concern about a lot of what is being proposed, and here he's talking about he's talking about this in a good sense of like making sure that the educational institutions are not able to promote values that are opposed to that of the common people, and getting people in positions of influence, in political influence, that are able to put a stop to that. I like the idea. Why does it sound terrible? Is increasing the power of government over things like this is great when your guy's in power. And I am just not convinced that there is a way forward in increasing government in our current state of things, of not leaving open the possibility of the wrong person getting in power and then just having things far worse than they are. Like, this just seems kind of like a pipe dream to me. It makes me quite nervous. Okay, encouragement for graduates of elite schools to pursue atypical jobs, so that people coming out of elite institutions are not only, in certain fields. I also don't know if I like this either. To me, that just kind of sounds like that means that the managerial class now has control over what more things. This is how I see it. I don't know. But I know what he's thinking is this also would kind of open up opportunities for people who attend those institutions who are not part of that class. I don't know. And then ultimately what he really wants is larger government as a counterweight to the destabilizing economic order. And this is my fear. This is my fear with all of this, with his solution, is that like bigger government, if the right people are in charge with your values, sounds great. But big government also leads always, I think, to more corruption. And I do think big government is always going to lead to the possibility then of the other guy or the other people with opposite values getting in power. And if they're going to follow this strategy and be just as forceful as he's calling for those who follow his ideas to be, it would sound like a disaster. So, well, that's final thoughts here. I hope that you enjoyed this. I know it's a little different from most of the topics I talk about, but I did want to talk about his new book. And, read the book yourself. What I just gave you at the very end, that's a very brief summary. He gives more depth, but not as much as I would like on this. So in my view, I think that a lot of what he's saying aligns with the same things that I've been saying, but how do we actually implement this is always the difficulty. And I don't know. I don't know that there is a great solution to that. And I don't necessarily think the Deneen solution to this is great, but maybe you have the answer. I don't know. So let me know what you think, though. This is a topic that is important, and I would love to hear your thoughts on Deneen. If you've read the book, if you haven't read the book, give your thoughts on what I've said here, too. So make sure you subscribe to the channel as well as subscribe to our podcast, and we'll see you in the next video. God bless.